Quarantine is where we separate or restrict the movement of persons in order to prevent the spread of a contagious or infectious disease. And so, for example, in the COVID-19 situation, what we have asked persons is those especially who have traveled abroad recently, especially to countries that have local transmission, meaning have a number of cases, we ask them to self-quarantine at home. And this is to prevent persons from possibly exposing others to the virus. But persons in quarantine are what we call asymptomatic. That means they are not expressing or showing signs and symptoms of the disease yet. This is why we quarantine persons for approximately 14 days, because based on the information we have about COVID-19, this is how long some persons may take to actually start expressing or showing signs and symptoms of the disease. So the incubation period of the virus is 1 to 14 days. It is important for us to be reminded of the fact that quarantine are for those individuals who are what we call asymptomatic, that is not showing any signs or symptoms of the disease. It is different from isolation. Isolation is a higher level of quarantine, if you like, wherein persons who are actually showing signs and symptoms of the disease are isolated in one of our hospitals and therefore would be screened and tested for the disease at that time. Individuals who are in home or self-quarantine should not be going outside in terms of going about their daily routine business for 14 days. Remember, quarantining is about restricting movement so that we minimize the risk of potential exposure to others of getting COVID-19. And so persons would be at home, separated from other persons in the household. So for example, making sure they're in a bedroom that doesn't necessarily share a bathroom with other persons. The room should be well ventilated. They're not sharing utensils, for example. They are making sure that they're cleaning their space or room regularly and not, entertaining visitors. So therefore, you're decreasing the risk of exposure. Another important thing about quarantine is monitoring persons to see whether or not they develop signs and symptoms within that period of time. And so this is also another important point about quarantine. So it's seeing whether or not, even though the individual at the start of it may have been asymptomatic, that is not showing any signs or symptoms, that we are monitoring to see whether or not they develop signs and symptoms of the disease. Additionally, for persons who are in self-quarantine or home quarantine, it is important for them to remember the general infection prevention and control measures, which means hand washing and hand hygiene is very important, making sure they're disinfecting, especially the common touch surfaces, and making sure that they're staying away from crowded areas of the household and restricting their movements within the household itself. Once someone is coming in from a country that has local transmission, then they should self-quarantine for 14 days. And that is the protocol across the board. So regardless of whether or not someone on that flight is then confirmed as COVID-19 positive, then those persons would already have been in self-quarantine and therefore would be monitoring themselves for development of signs and symptoms of the disease. And then they would notify the Ministry of Health and Wellness through the different mechanisms that have been advertised. So we may have colleagues, friends, or persons that we know that have traveled from a country that has local transmission of COVID-19 and therefore are on mandatory self-quarantine. And if that's the case and the person is therefore practicing appropriately the separation in terms of within the household, then the other individuals within the household can go about their business doing it as per usual. That means going to work, going to other conduct business in the wider community or society. However, it does not negate that those individuals who, even though they are not on self-quarantine, they also must practice the infection prevention and control procedures as everyone else is being encouraged to do. They also have to practice social distancing and making sure that they're staying the required 3 feet or 1 meter away from other individuals. Also remember that persons who are on self-quarantine do not have signs and symptoms of the disease at this point. We are just quarantining those individuals because of the fact that they may develop signs and symptoms of the disease at some point after. And so therefore we want to monitor them closely at this point in time. But it doesn't mean that persons within the household will necessarily be at risk of developing the disease once it is that persons are practicing the self-quarantine measures appropriately. Ladies and gentlemen, I therefore encourage us strongly to practice the appropriate hand hygiene, making sure we are practicing proper cough etiquette and all the other infection prevention and control measures that we know about, the social distancing. I know some of us want to be visiting each other, hanging out on the roadside, etc. But at this point in time, social distancing is best. And so I just want to encourage us that if we put these measures in place and follow the instructions of the Ministry of Health and Wellness, and by extension the government of Jamaica, then we will see the light at the end of the tunnel after we have come through this challenge successfully. Thank you.